Okay, Liz Thompson with Sew with Liz is back, and I am doing the finishing touches to my grandson's quilt. I showed you in the other short video how to prepare your quilt label for the back of the quilt. Now I am preparing my binding strips, and I cut them 2.5 inches wide, mainly because the quilt, which you will see in due course, has got a fairly wide dark blue border in a solid fabric. So I could afford to have a wide-ish binding on the quilt. And so this little video is just to show how I join my strips of fabric together. So they've all been cut at 2.5 inches wide, and I have not chopped the selvage edges off because I sew my binding at a diagonal, the binding strips together at a diagonal, and my machine has a jam-proof bobbin system, so even though I sewed through a bit of fresh air there, it doesn't jam up. So now I've come to the other end of this piece of binding, and I make sure as I work that I don't flip it accidentally, because then I may have my binding join on the wrong side of the binding. So I do pay attention to that as I'm working. And then I look again to see which is the right and the wrong side of my binding. Sometimes it's quite difficult to see. In this case, it's not too bad. I go with the sort of markings on the selvage that can kind of tell me. So again, I'm sewing in fresh air, and now I am just eyeballing a 45-degree angle across those two pieces of fabric. You could, if you don't feel so confident, what you could do, or you like things to be more accurate than perhaps I necessarily worry about, you certainly can mark a diagonal in with your ruler and a marking pen. I don't worry with that because I've never found that it being off by 0.5 millimeter or 1 millimeter is an issue. All right, so now I have sewn all of my pieces of binding together, and I chain sewed. So all I have to do is cut the little piece of stitching in between each of my pieces, and now I have one long piece of binding to go all the way around my quilt. But before I take it to the ironing board, I am going to trim all of my seam allowances to roughly 1/4 inch. All right, these are going to then be pressed open. Now, normally when we are working with quilting, we don't press our seams open. We press them to one side like that. But when we're doing binding, we don't really want extra bulk that you can actually feel with your fingers on your binding. So when I go to the ironing board after I've trimmed all these seam allowances, I am actually going to fold and iron my seam open. So because of that, I didn't want little kind of openings or holes to show on this side. So what I did was I actually decreased the length of my stitch. It comes up automatically as 2.4. Well, what I did was I reduced it to 2, or you could even go to 1.9 or 1.8 if you chose. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do, and I'm not going to worry to take you to the ironing board and show you what I'm going to do, but the idea now is that I'm going to, at the ironing board, fold it over and press. And do you see that now I have distributed the bulk of the seam here and the seam there? It's not all together in one place if I was to have joined them at a 90-degree angle. I used to do that way back in the beginning days of my quilting, and I wondered why I had these lumpy bumpies in my binding. It really wasn't attractive. So now I just take a little bit of extra time, not much, and I do it with a 45-degree angle. And then opening that seam flat also reduces a lot of the bulk. So if you run your finger over it here, you can barely feel the bulk, and that will then be sewn onto the edge of my quilt. So I will be back with another video, another short video to show you that process, but I'm now going to go to the ironing board. See you again soon.